My name's Harley McIlrath, and I am from Grinnell, Iowa. And tonight I'm at Prairie Lights to read from Possum Trot, my collection of short stories. The question I get most often is it true, or did it really happen? And I say, of course it's true, and maybe it really happened, or maybe it didn't. But it seems to be important to them to know whether the events were fabricated in my mind, or whether it was journalistic, something that actually happened and I'm reporting it. I like to keep it somewhat ambiguous. In this book I've kept it a little ambiguous because I've mixed in some nonfiction, very short pieces that address the same sort of subject that the stories address, and they're very obviously not in a narrative voice. They're not telling a story, it's more of an essay. And that sort of lends more of a factual feel, I think, to a grounding for the rest of the stories that are fiction in the book. I've read a lot of Hemingway, and I like Hemingway, and I temper his minimalism and conciseness with Richard Brautigan. I read a lot of Richard Brautigan, and in many ways I think Brautigan was kind of like Hemingway on acid. He's doing the same strict reportage that Hemingway did, only it's more imaginative. And he uses the same sort of language, but he's more playful and goes into some very odd places. And I think the playfulness is important to me in my writing. A lot of what I write about is dark, and I like to temper that with some humor and some odd imagery. I write, I have a garden shed, and my wife teases me because I talk to people about the garden shed, and they envision this outbuilding, with rakes and hoes and things hanging on the walls, and that's what this outbuilding was supposed to be. But my father started renovating it. He first said, "Oh, the siding's kind of bad, you need to redo that." And then we wound up ripping the wood out of the grain bins that were in the old corn crib and lined the walls of the garden shed. So it's got a wood paneling that you probably can't buy in a lumberyard anymore. The wood was really good, hard, old stuff. And it's got a ceiling fan, it's got bookshelves on the wall, I've got a lawyer's desk, and I've got electricity, lights, and phone, and so I try to write out there, and I can see out the windows, and I like to have the windows, and I'm able to see the fields and my dad's barn and the house that I grew up in out the windows as I work, and that's, it's just kind of an inspiration for the sort of things that I write. I started my family late in life, so I have a 7-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son, and they require lots of attention, and I do a lot of 4th grade homework. And so sitting at the kitchen table or trying to do something quickly, if I have to be, if I've got a deadline where something needs to be done and I have to do it now, and I have to work in the house because I need to watch the kids, that's the difficult setting. I read a lot, and back to Brautigan. I read Brautigan because he is freeing for me. He wasn't afraid to try things, and he did really off the wall, strange things, and it recharges my batteries because I stop worrying so much about doing it right the first time and getting a first draft that's perfect. If I tell myself it's okay, I can be strange, I can be wild, I can be out there, and then it's fun again, and I make it play rather than work, and I go off with something, and 9/10 of it might get pulled out later. But that's how I got excited about a new project, was just try to think of some wild, interesting angle to take on the subject matter. This is interesting because I have always done short fiction. I've never done a novel. And so my work has been written over a period of about 30 years and never brought together. And so when we did this collection of short pieces and put them all in a single between 2 covers, and I started looking at them, I had to edit a lot of things because there are 2 barns near where I live that are huge. And I used them, I've loved those things and watched them for years. And they kept popping up in stories. I'd use them as an anecdote, or I'd need some reference point. And there's one story, the title story, Possum Trot, where they're the significant feature of the story. It's kind of centers on them. But then there were other stories where I needed two characters just to have some idle chatter for a while, and one of the characters would mention those barns, and they would talk about those barns. So once I put all those stories so close together, I had to start pulling things like those barns out, because they were too close together. The reader reads them. I wrote it 30 years apart. The reader reads it 5 minutes apart, thinks, God, these two barns are the only thing this guy can think of. Yeah, I spent a long time in a place in Cedar Falls called Stebbs that has a lot of interesting characters that hung out there, and I've wanted to write a story centered around there, but bar stories are kind of tedious because everybody thinks that their bar is interesting, and it's not necessarily the case. But there's a lot of characters there that I've wanted to work with that were quirky and interesting, and even though they were kind of screw-ups as far as their life went, they had interesting things to say, and I think it's neat when a kind of down-and-out character comes up with really profound statements, and it happens frequently, I think, in places like that. So there's characters from that setting that I would like to use, and whether it gets wound up, whether it winds up as a story that uses that as an aside, or whether I center a whole book around that, I don't know. I think I'd like to do a whole book around that area. Well, there's a spiritual dimension in the sense that, or a mystical thing in the sense that the ideas come from somewhere. I mean, a story somehow funnels through a writer and gets onto a page, and I think any writer would probably tell you they don't necessarily know where that came from and how it wound up on the page. I don't remember who it was. Somebody I read once said it was like putting up the antenna. You just put up an antenna, and somehow you receive this story that comes in, and you put it down on the page. So there's a spiritual aspect to that. Also, for me, it's a meditation. Often when I'm working on a story, it's a way for me to meditate on a time or a place or a person or a group of people that might be gone. And that allows me to kind of remember them and be with them for a little bit as I think about them and how they'll be in the story. Well, liberally, a writer is anybody that creates things with words, with the written word. I don't call myself a writer. I think of myself as someone who writes, because I think to be a writer it's kind of an honor that someone bestows on you when they call you a writer, rather than claiming to be that. Maybe rather than talk about writing, I'll talk about baseball. My dad was a ball player. He loved baseball. He grew up, I think when he was 14, he played on his high school baseball team. Played high school baseball, graduated, played some semi-pro ball. Never was in the minors, never was in pro ball, but he was a good ball player. He played fast pitch softball for years until he was into his 40s. And he loved the game, and he knew the game, and he was good at the game. He could watch a baseball game on TV or at the stadium, and he wasn't, he enjoyed that. He wasn't a person who was interested in statistics, didn't care what batting averages, people had, didn't care who was leading the league in home runs, but he knew the mechanics of the game. He knew if the ball went down, if somebody bunted down the first base line, he knew where the pitcher was supposed to go, where the first baseman, who covered first, whether it was the second baseman, knew those kinds of things. So my dad could sit down at a table with any ball players, Hall of Fame baseball players, and hold his own and be in the conversation. And he would have stories to tell. He could tell about the time he slid into home plate and broke his nose on the catcher's spike, and that story would be no better or worse than something Mickey Mantle could tell. My dad could tell about the time they were in the tournament and somebody hit a home run and the ball was hit so far that the guy on second base waited and waited to see if it would be caught. And while he waited, the guy that hit the home run passed him on the base paths, which was an out. So he went straight from third base into the dugout, and and he could sit and he could hold his own at the table with Mickey Mantle and all those other guys and tell a story that would be interesting to everyone. And I think if you translate ball player into writer, that's what a writer is.